Well, good evening. Happy Sabbath. And
Happy Sabbath.
we're going to begin our study with a word of prayer as we continue this study on the three angels' messages of righteousness by faith. Dear Father in heaven, we are so thankful for the end of this week, for the labor that you have given us to do that is a blessing, but also for the rest that we can find in the Sabbath. And we know, Lord, that these typify the laboring together with Christ and the peace and rest that we find as we experience Christ's righteousness in our lives. We come to you this evening, Lord, asking that you can help us as we go through this study. We know A.T. Jones can be difficult read, and we know that we're not completely familiar with all these things happening, but we know that were happening in 1893, but we can see the parallel with the events of today. And I just pray that you can help us to sort through this and to see how it relates to the message that we are to give and that we are to experience. Be with us now through thy Spirit, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, good evening. And this study of A.T. Jones' 1893 General Conference Bulletin Sermons was something I had read back in, I believe it would have been 1986 when I first read them. Might have been 1987. And I remember I read Wagner's book, Christ Our Righteousness, sometimes titled The Righteousness of Christ or Christ and His Righteousness, first, and then I read Jones' material. So the 1893 and the 1895 General Conference Bulletins. Now, A.T. Jones is presently going through an explanation of what was currently happening or what had just happened in regard to the Chicago World's Fair, also known as the Columbian, what's the thing called?
Columbian Exposition.
Yeah, the World's Columbian Exposition. Yeah. And so he had been involved in not as much as he was in 1888. So with the Blair Bill in 1888, he was much more involved than he was with this, but he was still involved. And so I had, for some reason in my mind, conflated these two things. I had not realized that there were two different events that Jones was involved in. And part of that would have just been my weakness of understanding this history. So I know Jones had presented in 1888, and I'd read his book where he makes those arguments. Now, one of the things that he says in the previous one is that the arguments that we can't buy into these arguments, because the arguments that they had for initially wanting the fair closed on Sunday are going to be the same arguments that they want to have the fair open on Sunday. And the danger there is that we can look at an issue on its surface and think that we are supporting something good, but we need to understand the motives and reasons behind it. And so this is really what he's trying to lay out as he goes through these presentations. Now, you're going to see as we go through this one that some of what he's saying, we can see a direct parallel to how we look at the world today as people in this movement. So we're just going to start reading this and going through it. Feel free to make comments, ask questions. I'm not 100% right now, so I really do need your help, but we also need the help of the Holy Spirit guiding us, which I believe he will. So Jones says, I will take up the subject where we stopped last night and read just two sample statements of those we had in mind when the hour closed last night. Here's one. Mr. Chairman and gentlemen of the committee and the friends and opponents of this measure, allow me to call attention to one thing, and that is a fact to which we all assent. None of this company will be here in 1993. Now, it's kind of an interesting statement because we know this is 100 years then, that he's talking about 100 years from now. But what's 1993 for this movement? We don't particularly have it as a waymark as such.
It's 3 years before the movement started.
It's 4 years, 1989. Right. So 1996, Jeff is going to write those articles that get published as, I can't think of the title of the paper.
Time of the end.
Yeah, Time of the End magazine. Thank you.
Time of the end.
Yeah, but in 1993, he does his first publication, which is, I believe, called Parallel Lines. So I just think it's an interesting reference here to 1993. He says, at that time, all of us shall be of one mind in regard to the value and sacredness of the Lord's Day, for the sentence has gone forth against every man, set thine house in order. How fast they fall, those we have known, as leaves from autumn branches grown, are quickly seared. But while men die, the nation lives. May the God of nations so guide us and our posterity that America may be sung until the end of time. From the speech of C.V. Botsford before the House Committee on the World's Exposition. Okay. Then he says another one. There's just one general reason, Mr. Chairman and gentlemen of the committee, I would like to give why this fair ought to be kept closed on the Sabbath, which they mean, of course, Sunday. If these gates are open on the Sabbath, it will be perilous to us as a nation, and it will be perilous to Chicago and to the interests of the fair. There's one thing we are to remember, and that is that God still reigns. God is still on the throne. God has not abdicated. And he has declared that the nation or the country that will not serve him shall perish. And more than this, we are to remember that the Ten Commandments are the very basis of all our laws, national and state, which subserve our liberties and our rights. Take the Fifth Commandment, take the Sixth Commandment against murder and protection of life, protection to person. It is based on that Sixth Commandment. Take the Seventh Commandment. Now, here is the Fourth Commandment, to the very heart of these 10 commandments, and that has never been repealed any more than has the Fifth Commandment or the Sixth Commandment or the Seventh Commandment or the Eighth Commandment. I always find it interesting that Sunday keepers will talk about the Fourth Commandment as never being repealed, but if you mention the Sabbath is done away. But anyway, and therefore we are to remember that if we touch this commandment of God, standing thus in the very heart of these 10 commandments, we touch the honor of God. We touch the law of God. For Christ has emphasized that fourth commandment. He said the Sabbath was made for man. What did he mean by that? He meant thereby that it was not made for the Jew only, but for man everywhere, in every age and in every condition. He said the Sabbath was made for man. It was made for man in all ages, in all time. He said the Sabbath was made for man. It was made for man's highest good in every age of the world, for his good morally and physically. And therefore it is, dear friends, if we touch that fourth commandment, which lies at the very root of all the other commandments, we touch the honor of God and the commandments of God. It has never been repealed. And if we touch that God will bring a curse, if we touch that, God will bring a curse upon us as a nation, because he distinctly told his people anciently that he would punish them for the profanation of the Sabbath day. And therefore it is, dear friends, that we as a nation cannot afford to touch this commandment. What it becomes us to do is, therefore, to set to the nations of the world a good example of the American Sabbath, set them an example of the Christian Sabbath, set them an example of the Sabbath as God has ordained it. And of course, they're talking about Sunday, which is not the Sabbath, definitely as God has ordained it. A heathen prince once visited Queen Victoria, so he's going on in his speech here, and desired the queen to give him the secret of the government's greatness. Queen Victoria sent for a Bible and handing that to him said, "There is the secret of the nation's greatness." And the secret of our greatness as a nation is the Bible that is enthroned in all the laws on the line of the Sabbath. That is the foundation of our laws. In the speech of Reverend F.A. McCarroll before the House Committee on World's Fair, January 11th, 1893. So Jones goes on, I read these simply as samples of the arguments that were presented to the committee to persuade Congress to stand fast in the position where the government has been placed. Now, brethren, you remember I took a text last night that was to last a week. Tonight I want to read another passage in the same line. It is this. So when he says a passage, he's talking about the spirit of prophecy, right? Brethren and sisters, would that I might say something to awaken you to the importance of this time and the significance of the events that are now taking place about us. I point you to the aggressive movements now being made for the restriction of religious liberty. So in this here, I just want to, so he doesn't tell us where he's taking this from. So this is from Testimonies to the Church, volume 6, page 18. And it's quoted here by Jones. So this is also going to be, let me see. So Ellen White actually presents this December 21st, 1892. And, or it's a, let me see here. It's going to be, I think it's going to be read. So it was written December 21st, 1892, but it's going to be read on January 28th, 1893, or published anyway in the General Conference Bulletin on January 28th, 1893. So Jones is referring to this article. So this is the spirit of prophecy. And so I want to just read it again. Brethren and sisters, would that I might say something to awaken you to the importance of this time and the significance of the events that are now taking place about us. I point you to the aggressive movements now being made for the restriction of religious liberty. So Ellen White's saying this at that time. Now, when we think about this, this is, about 4 years after the 1888 General Conference. Now we know that the Sunday law that we talked about earlier, that Jones dealt with the Blair Bill, that we often talk about the 1888, that Sunday law, which never came into effect because of this work. And so Ellen White is now referring to this again in a more closer connection with what Jones is talking about here. So here's what Jones says. That is what we want to study tonight. And as I, with the help of the Lord, shall bring before your minds things that are, I want you to be anxious to receive and see these things as God is, that we shall, in order that we may see and meet his mind in this respect. There are doubtless people in this house who were here about 3 years ago when a subject was given me, which was, I think, the present crisis. Those who were here will remember that in referring to our work at that time, which was petitioning Congress and remonstrating against all this legislation, I called attention to the fact that that was our work at that time. It was to circulate these petitions everywhere throughout all the land, that by this means we might waken the minds of the people of the United States against that matter, and to have their petitions to go to Congress in such abundance that Congress might see what the principle is and that we might perhaps delay that legislation. So the idea behind this, because we talked about this last week, was are signing petitions against the vaccine or other types of things proper? So one is they're signing a petition. This is a petition that they've made. And their motives for making this petition is to bring a knowledge to the people and to Congress, and also perhaps delay the legislation is another aspect of it. But it's not about standing up for their rights, right? And it's not political, what Jones was doing, what the church was doing back at that time. The idea was that of getting the truth before the people by that means. And you will remember that I called attention to this thought, that work would continue only until Sunday had been adopted, until some Sunday law should be passed, and then all our petitioning would be passed, and our work in that direction would be stopped, because it would be no use for us to protest against Congress doing a thing which was already done. Now, he's going to maybe explain this a bit more, but can anybody comment on what he's talking about? Why does he make this point? Why would it be no use for us to protest against Congress doing a thing which was already done? I mean, what is his purpose here? So he's saying we can protest, but once they make their decision, there's no point. Is that what he's saying? Any thoughts on this, anyone?
Well, once it's passed, it's hard to get it repealed, ain't it?
Well, yes, but I mean, it's possible they could go back another direction, but I don't think that's really the main reason, because this is really about presenting a message. It's not really about stopping something as much as it's about calling attention to something. He says, well, we are there now. We are in the place that I referred to the night about 3 years ago. From the evidence that was given last night, it is clearly seen that the government of the United States is now in the hands of a hierarchy, and no longer in the hands of the representatives of the people. Can we say that today? Now,
I would say so.
okay. So one of the things back, when I first became an Adventist, we talked about the coming Sunday law and all these different steps that were taken that would lead to a Sunday law. Things to do with the ecumenical movement, concessions to the papacy, of course, Reagan and Pope John Paul II. And different things with the moral majority and so forth. So when we look at what's happening here, I mean, this seems to be more parallel with what happened on January 6, 2021, in how he's describing this. Would people agree with me on that? Now, is Jones being overly dramatic?
Yes.
Okay, so good, because I think he is. I don't think that would be the case there.
But that's not uncommon for his time period.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's not uncommon in a sense for every time period, in that different things that have happened at different times. I can think about how people would just say, this is basically the end. I mean, the next thing we're going to have is a Sunday law. And things have definitely not progressed to a Sunday law. And basically in the 1990s, it looked like a Sunday law was imminent. Then 9/11 happened, and that Sunday law was delayed. And now we can say, well, 9/11 also put in place things that would also support a Sunday law structurally. So some people say, well, you couldn't have had a Sunday law before 9/11. But things change. Different people are in charge. Generations come, generations go. And we live in a very different time from the 1990s, philosophically, religiously, politically. So in some ways, you can see why Jones is looking in that direction, because we always are looking in that way. But I do think he's being overly dramatic, and that I think often we have been overly dramatic about things that have occurred. Doesn't mean those things weren't important, but things don't move as quickly as we would think they should. But we know when the last events will be rapid ones. So when the Sunday law.
Hello,
Hi, Mark. Nice to see you.
you two guys.
Okay.
Let's see all of you guys. And I just say this now. Happy summer for Fido and everybody. And have a good evening.
Okay. Well, thank you. Happy Sabbath, Mark. Okay. So anyway, so he says it's irretrievably gone now. I mean, that I think is, of course, not correct. So government of the people, by the people, and for the people is gone. The authority of the government from the people expressed in the Constitution and the government to be conducted according to the Constitution is gone. The Constitution has been overridden, and now it is ignored. It was ignored by the committee the other day, in fact, shut out entirely, and a hierarchy heard upon hierarchical positions, giving hierarchical arguments only. When that is so, when the Constitution itself is shut out from before, and from the Constitution of a committee of Congress, whose only authority is the Constitution, and this and other matter is received instead.
Consideration.
Consideration? Oh, what did I say?
You said Constitution.
Oh, okay.
Word above it and below it.
Okay. From the consideration of a committee of Congress, whose only authority is the Constitution, and this other matter is received instead, then where has the government gone? Do you know? Where has it gone? Answer from the audience: into the hands of the churches. Well, from the extracts I read last night, it is confessed that Congress dare not act according to their own view, according to the principles which they themselves hold, for fear of what the churches will do, and that they dare not act in a way that fair-minded men desire them to act, because of a fear of what the churches will do in creating more mischief and more trouble to the nation than if they acted the other way. That is precisely the reason that Judge Hammond gave in justifying his decision in an article which was printed afterward in the same paper in which his decision was printed, that when churches demand legislation of that kind, it was correct statesmanship to grant it, because Protestants were a fighting people, and if they did not give them what they wanted, they would cause such trouble in the nation that the state would perish. That is the thought. What is that but just simply saying that the principles which actuate the professed Protestant churches of the United States are identical with the papal principles from the beginning to end? And the reason which they gave for the legislation at the first is simply papal principles outright. That resolution which the churches sent up to Congress demanding this legislation is as follows: Resolved, that we do hereby pledge ourselves and each other that we shall from this day henceforth refuse to vote for or support for any office or position of trust any member of Congress, either senator or representative, who shall vote for any further aid of any kind for the World's Fair, except on conditions named in these resolutions. Richard W. Thompson of Indiana, who was the Secretary of the Navy under President Hayes' administration, has well said, to allow any church to dictate beforehand what laws should or should not be passed is to deprive the people of authority of government which they ordained in their own hands, and to transfer it to such church. And that is so. That has been done, and from the words that they have spoken and the representatives which we read last night. It stands as a literal fact before the world tonight that the government of the United States is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, as our fathers made it, but the subjection of the people by the churches and for the churches. The church rules the government. She has it in her hands, and she is holding it there, and she proposes to hold it there. Now, if we look at what Jones is saying that's happening in 1993 or 1893, I mean, as we said, it seems overly dramatic. But is it true that the United States was heading for a Sunday law in this history? Was that happening? Was that in the works? Somebody needs to comment. Yeah or nay?
I'm sorry, what was your question?
Well, the question is, was the United States heading for a Sunday law in the early 1890s?
Well, it was apparent that they were.
Okay, so I think it's true that they were. But just like in the 1990s, the United States was heading for a Sunday law. But something railroaded, or not railroaded, that's the wrong word.
Deferred it?
Sidetracked,
Side-
derailed is what I'm
Derailed.
thinking. Derailed that
That's a
Sunday
good
law
word.
movement. Yeah. So that Sunday law movement was derailed. But the question is how and why? Now, we could say it's because God's people were not ready for a Sunday law, right? They had rejected the message of righteousness by faith. And we haven't fully studied into the line dealing with this, because there is a line that addresses it. But we know that in 1888, righteousness by faith, the third angel's message, was now proclaimed. Now, the third angel arrived on October 22nd, 1844. But it's going to go through this history. But in this history of Jones, we're going to see that the church has rejected the first and second angel's messages, so it can't receive the third. So from a spiritual point of view for the church is unready for a Sunday law. But what about in the world? What's happening in the world that changes things? Why is the United States in this history definitely interested to a large degree in a Sunday law? Many Americans are interested, it seems, or at least the churches are interested in it.
So,
I'm sorry.
go ahead, bro.
No, you go ahead. It's all right.
Well, a lot of the people in the churches see the world going to hell in a hat bag.
Okay,
I mean,
so I mean, we're not really that familiar with what's happening in the world in the 1890s. I mean, not really. We don't really know that history.
Where did it have something to do with Islam?
Okay, well, you have a lot of things happening. So we know that there is the marshaling of the nations, right? So this is a precursor to what's going to eventually turn into World War I. So yes, we have the sick man of the East. That's part of it. Turkey. We have this anticipation of what's happening in Europe. And could we say that there is a parallel from the 1890s to the 1990s as far as this anticipation of a Sunday law, but that there is going to be an event that's going to and philosophically, the need for the Sunday law at that time. I don't know if I'm expressing my question well, but would we say
I'm
that
having a hard time understanding what you're asking.
okay, so the First World War, did it change the perspective, perspective of Americans? Did it change how people looked at religion?
The attitude.
Yeah, well, how they saw the world.
It did for a time, and then people went back to whatever they were thinking before.
Well, yeah, then you're going to get the 20s, right?
Well, ain't that when they had the start of the UN? It wasn't the UN called the UN then. It was called the
League of
forgot.
Nations.
the League of
League of Nations,
Nations.
that's going to be related to the First World War, yeah. So you're going to have the League of Nations, but I'm talking just about what has happened to America, because America is relatively religious in the 1890s. I mean, if I was alive in the 1890s and I published my book on chronology, I'd probably be able to make a good living writing on biblical chronology. Right? I mean, it was a different world, you know.
There was more interest in it.
Yeah. And churches and religions, I mean, these were powerful institutions. You know, even if you look at even into the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, I mean, if you were a minister, you were a highly respected person in the community. Now nobody would really even care. Right. So the world has changed. The world was very religious, United States especially, and it's become very, very secular. So the world has changed, but I would think that
I've noticed a change over the last 40 or 50 years.
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt there's been a change. Even the biblical knowledge that people had when I was younger, the average person, had enough biblical knowledge at least to make jokes about the Bible. Now the average person
Right.
doesn't even understand the jokes, right? And I'm not saying that, you know, I don't approve of biblical jokes, but you couldn't have somebody like Bill Cosby doing the Noah skit nowadays. It wouldn't really, even though they have movies based on this type of thing, the average person doesn't even really distinguish that the Bible is something that's
credible.
Yeah, they don't know much about it. I mean, they couldn't even tell you, you know, the basic stories, right? So we have a biblically illiterate society today, which the world was very biblically literate in the 1890s. So, so we see that there is this, and this has always been the problem of the Sunday law. The problem of the Sunday law for me, as a Seventh-day Adventist, is that how do you have a Sunday law in a secular society? It would make sense in the 1890s, in a religious society, but in a secular society, it never really made much sense to me. But 9/11 changed that for me, and events that have unfolded since then. So we start to understand that this Sunday law, it reaches deep, and especially this pandemic, of what these laws are about. They're not about religion. They're about control and power. Correct? The Sunday
Yes.
Yeah. The Sunday law is not going to come about because people are particularly religious, but the governments and the people in charge in the world want to control us. And so the connections that are going to happen, why they're going to, the reasons for the Sunday law are going to be quite different reasons than people had in the 1890s on the surface. But deep down, wasn't it about control?
Well, yeah, it's kind of always been about control.
Okay.
That's how government gets founded, and that's what government has succeeded on the last, especially our government over the last 200 and some odd years.
Okay, so thank you for that. So let's look at more what Jones has to say. He says, now, when that had been done, it was perfectly proper for us or anybody else and all the people to demand that it should be undone. Having done it, even for the reasons for which it was done, Congress could have undone it, could have opened its eyes and stepped back again precisely where it was before. Congress could have undone this thing and left it where they should have left it at the first, and then the churches would have had to make another effort to gain possession of the government. But instead of listening to that demand upon the only basis they have a right to consider any question, the basis of the Constitution, they shut out the Constitution and all arguments upon the Constitution, openly refused to hear it, and played into the hands of the churches which had already secured this, and thus fixing indelibly in the legislation of the country that thing which had been done, has been done. Then that is virtually the second step. When the first step was taken, the next step could have been taken backward, but that would have undone it. But instead of taking that step, what is being done is only to confirm what has been done, and then the thing never can go back. Now, his point here, if we look at the problems of, let's say, this pandemic, so we're gonna say that this is a type of a Sunday law, and we can compare these two things. If the government gives us our freedom, so to speak, withdraws all this stuff regarding vaccines, has it really changed anything? Or has the government and the people in power gained something that they're not going to give back? That is, they're not going to acknowledge our freedoms, our religious freedoms, but that they will just give us, they'll give us back in form or on the surface, but principally hasn't the government changed its way in which it can control? So if the government gives us freedom or permission, well, you don't have to get vaccinated. It doesn't mean we're back where we were before the pandemic, right?
No.
Right.
We've taken these steps, and these steps, they're not going to go and say, well, we were completely wrong about what we did, but we're going to, be able to travel again and not get vaccinated. And so we can think, oh, everything's back to where it was before.
It will never be that way again.
But the steps have been taken that can't be retraced.
It's like what happened at 9/11.
Yeah, well, 9/11. So we have this.
Security has never been the same before again.
Yeah, we can't just go down to the airport, buy a plane ticket, and jump on a plane without showing any ID. I mean, there was a time you could do that. Now there's all kinds of security checks, and those things aren't being withdrawn, even though they really make no sense. They never made sense in the first place. But they definitely don't make
Just
sense.
another way of gathering intelligence on you.
Yeah, it's
That's
about
all it is.
it's about control. Yeah. And we're going to see that with lots of things that are going to happen in the future. These are things that they're putting in place that they can control us. And so we are unsafe. And this is what's happening in Jones' day in the 1890s. A.T. Jones is seeing these steps, and he can see how they can't be retraced, unless, of course, they did really retrace them and go back and say we're all wrong in the first place. But that doesn't happen. But there's a lot of steps that still would have to be taken to end up in a Sunday law. Excuse me.
Yeah, it's like the blue laws in the United States. They got them all in books already, but they ain't enforcing them. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah. Okay. Now, what errand have we to Washington anymore? What place have we in Washington anymore with petitions or hearings protesting against religious legislation? None at all. We have no more such errands to Washington. There's no place for any of our petitions there anymore. That is the situation as it is now. Some have asked, well, suppose new legislation comes up. Can't we send up a protest against that and go and ask a hearing upon that? What would be the basis of our argument? What would be the basis of our protest? That it is unconstitutional, but the Constitution has been overridden in this, and we would be met with the reply that it has been done already, and that this is constitutional. That has been declared. And when this is taken as constitutional, everything else follows. And this could be true of the restrictions that have been put upon Americans with the pandemic, correct? That has been declared. And when this is taken as constitutional, everything else follows. When I presented the idea that they might have been mistaken in the representations which were made to them, I was met with, your argument is not respectful to Congress. Elder Fifield says, suppose another National Sunday bill comes before another committee, might not that committee listen to a constitutional argument? And Jones says, well, suppose they did. What would be the force of it? The Constitution has been overridden already. This thing is unconstitutional. Sunday legislation is all unconstitutional. But all that has been done. And what would be the force of any argument against any other Sunday bill that is on the ground of its unconstitutionality? Where is the force of it? There would be simply none at all. So you can see that everything is gone, brethren. That is what I want you to think of, that the thing is gone. And the basis, the only basis which we ever had a right to go thereupon, the Constitution, is taken from us. We had the right to go there upon that basis because the Constitution is God's idea of government. The principle of the government of the United States is God's idea for governments. And when we were holding up the Constitution and the principles of it as the idea of God, as we did every time, and as the right idea, that was the thing that we had to do. God had given that as an example to all the world and as a light to all the world as the right ideas in government. We had the right to appeal to it. They wanted us to argue the other things against shutting the fair on Sunday. You see, we could not do that. And more than that, we can't argue against it being shut on Sunday for the reason that Sunday is not the Sabbath of the fourth commandment, because to argue that way would be simply allowing and admitting that Congress had properly incorporated the fourth commandment into the legislation. And if they would only recognize the day of the fourth commandment instead of Sunday, we would not have anything to say. But we have everything to say against that. That would be only to give away everything. Consequently, we could not leave our position on the Constitution. When they shut us out, they shut out the Constitution. I say, always we are in splendid company. For in being shut out by that committee from any constitutional argument, we are in splendid company, for we are in the company of the Constitution of the United States. And in order to get rid of us, they had to shut out the Constitution. That is the company in which we belong. So the sum of the whole matter is, we have no more errands to Washington such as we have had. Of course, whenever there come up other such questions, that will be a good place to put our principles before congressmen, if we spread the truth before all the people. But we have no more errands there with petitions or protests against religious legislation. That thing is gone. Well, in this work, which is now passed, what were we working against? Against something that was done, or against the doing of something? Against the doing of something. Why did we protest against the doing of that thing? What did we say that the doing of that thing would be? Forming a union of church and state, making an image to the beast. Now that thing is done, and there is no more protesting against the doing of it. So this is interesting here in that you can see Jones is saying that this is the forming of the union of church and state, or the making an image to the beast in what has occurred in 1893. So it's a rather interesting argument. Now, if we are to compare that to our day, would we say that there is a union of church and state in the pandemic.
Yes.
Okay. Now,
I would too, yeah.
can you explain, Dwight, a little bit more detail on how we would recognize this? How would we explain this to someone?
Church basically abdicated its role of bringing people together and worshiping God because the dictate of the state was to close all of the churches.
Okay, so this is an interesting point. Now, in the 1890s, it's the church basically petitioning the state to create this union, correct?
Yes.
But here, isn't it now the church falling to the concessions of the state? The church isn't initiating this
Correct.
control, right? So it's kind of an interesting point or scenario, the one that I'd never really thought of in the past. That is, in the past, as a Seventh-day Adventist, you look at the Sunday law. This is the moral majority. This is Christians. This is evangelicals, Protestants, Catholics, basically taking over the government and demanding this Sunday law. But we can see here in this history, it's the government that is really initiating this control, but the church is going along with it. Now, why is the church going along with it? Why did the churches support their being closed down? Why did the churches support forced vaccinations?
501c3.
Oh, okay.
Conference supported it too, some conferences.
Right, so it has to do with money,
Mhm.
right?
But it always has.
$30 billion to the Adventist healthcare system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's that nonprofit status.
It's always money or power.
Right. Now, in Alberta, and I don't know much about, it's probably the same everywhere, but in Alberta, the province of Alberta, because in Canada, the provinces have control over education, not the federal government. Adventist churches, of course, have schools in Alberta, just like they do other places. And in order to get government funding, they need to follow certain rules.
Mhm.
All this woke genderized stuff, it has to be promoted in Adventist schools. Do you think Adventist schools are going to turn down that money that comes from the government?
They haven't before.
No.
No.
No, I don't think so.
And they have not.
No,
Okay.
not in the right state of mind.
They got too many bills.
Right. And they have an expensive education system, much more expensive than it needs to be.
Mhm.
I'm not really sure why it costs so much to educate children, but they definitely need the money from the government. Right? Adventists already pay a lot for their children's education, which is already funded by the government. It's never made any sense to me why Adventist schools charge such large tuitions when a child can just go to a public school for free. They get the same funding. Well, maybe not exactly the same funding, but there are other private schools that just run.
To it.
Yeah, so other private schools can run without government funding. But yeah, so they definitely want the money from the government, because that money that comes from tax money follows the student wherever they go. And but yes, it's really about the money. It's about this nonprofit status. And the church, for me, I don't understand why people
Lack of faith.
I mean, the idea is that, well, the government's not going to, if we don't have nonprofit status, I guess you would be taxed by the government. Is that what would happen? Just like any business? I'm not quite sure.
Probably.
Or is it just that you get a tax receipt?
A 501c3
Yeah.
believes, or a 501c3 is established so that the members of the 501c3 receive a tax exempt status.
Right. So that they can donate money to the church and not be taxed.
Correct. If a 501c3 is rejected, then the tax burden falls upon the members of that 501c3.
Right. Okay. So that's what I would think happens. So, I mean, it's not a huge amount of money.
Excuse me?
Well, I mean,
Okay, let's
from an individual's point of view.
okay, let's say, let's just pick a number for a moment.
Okay.
Let's say that a member of a 501c3 is making $50,000 a year,
Yeah.
and they donate 10% of that money to the 501c3.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's say that they work at $50,000 a year for 30 years.
Yeah.
What does that amount come up to?
Well, I'd have to do the math. My mind.
So if you do 30 times $5,000, you'd come up with $150,000.
$150,000 over 30 years.
So if it's determined that a 501c3 is no longer operating properly as a 501c3, then that member would then be liable for that $150,000 given to that 501c3 and have to then pay taxes upon that. And that could be as much as, let's say, 30 to 40%. So if it's at 40% of $150,000, then they are going to be required then to pay forthwith $60,000 to the government.
Right.
It's a lot.
How many of us right now would have the ability to pay $60,000 on behalf of the church?
Well, okay. So you're saying, yeah, I really don't follow what you're saying. So you're saying that if they lose their status, the money that they gave in the past,
They could go back as far as they wanted.
really?
It's just not for 1 year. It's as far as they would want.
So really, that seems pretty bizarre. You wouldn't just grandfather it in. You wouldn't just say from henceforth.
Okay, I'll use a legal case.
Okay.
When the federal government decided to go after Alphonse Capone in Chicago,
Okay.
how did they go after him?
Well, tax evasion.
Correct. How far back did they go?
I don't know.
Isn't it something like 20 years?
Something about 20 years is right.
Okay, but there, a church has a 501c3 status now. And if it
Right.
loses that, you're saying they would just go back on all the people who ever donated money to it and say, we're
They
going to retroactively.
They could do the same thing as they did with Capone and go back at least 20 years.
I guess they could, but they wouldn't need to. I mean,
But what they need to
have
is-
they done that with a church that's lost its 501c3, 3C? whatever.
I would have to look up legal history on some of those points. But-
I'm sorry, you understand that if we're under the Constitution of the United States, that the federal government is not to tax a church.
Yeah, I understand taxing a church, but I'm talking about the individual who donates money, right? So I can see that, it's fine, they can't tax a church, but what people have done is they're giving money to the church and they're not paying tax on the money they give to the church. Where normally, if I donate money to somebody, I don't get a tax deductible receipt, right? So if I donate money, I just pay that money out of the money that I have after taxes. And that,
So
in a sense, has been taxed.
you take my situation. I get a paycheck every week, and they tax that money
Yeah.
off my paycheck. But when I pay my tithe and offerings, that's already taxed. I've already taxed it. It's already been taxed because I've already got.
Yeah, I understand that. So if you didn't give it to a 501c3 institution, you couldn't use it as a tax write-off. You would just be giving your money basically less of it because it's been taxed already, right? But I've never understood that principle of why somebody would want to get a tax write-off for money that they're giving to a church. It seems to me a rather dangerous concession to the government.
It is a concession to the government. The point is that they're attempting to avoid a larger amount of taxes.
Yes, but it just means you have less money to give.
No, I mean, consider it this way. They're trying to avoid paying more taxes.
The person giving the money?
Yes,
Yeah, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's just the money that you give that you're not getting taxed on. So let's say, I'm taxed at 40% and I can give $100,000, right? With a 501c3. But if I don't, I can only give 60,000, right? Right. So the idea is, well, since the government's not taxing me, I can still give more, but so it changes how much money I can give.
But most people don't see it that way. A lot of people actually give money because they pay less taxes.
Yeah, but
Right.
they could still get more money. The money's the same, it's a different amount of money, but you have so much money to live on, right? And you tithe.
Yeah.
So you're just going to be paying tax on the money that you're giving on tithe. So that means you'd have to give more money if you wanted to give 10%. But
Well, you
I
got to
don't have a
remember that
problem with
most of
that.
these people have been bamboozled into doing these things, and their reasoning is whatever they said it was for.
Okay. So render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. It seems that people are
Right.
trying to circumvent that by having a 501c3.
Yes, that's exactly.
Right. When you make the deduction on your tax credit for the 10% of tithe, okay, you get a deduction or a credit in your tax. So now you would potentially have to pay more money on that 10%. It's a business tactic here in the United States to give 10% of holdings that you've made over the year.
So do you think there are people in this movement who still keep giving their money to the church? I mean, I know it's totally irrational because they can give more to the church than if they gave it to, ministries that weren't 501c3.
I don't think in this movement.
You don't?
I mean, I don't think there's people in this movement that's doing that, but it's quite possible that there are.
Well, I know there are people in this movement that give money to the church still.
Really? Why would they do that?
That's a good question. But I think maybe that's one of the motives. It's like, I can give more.
Right.
So they could look at.
Excuse me, please.
Yeah, okay, Mark.
I hear you guys, you and other guy, talking about money give it to God. My mom said, you give money to God. It is blessing of God.
Right.
Thank Him. He done for you.
Okay.
You give the money to that church bank, pay rent to move.
Okay. So let me get this straight. So if a person is going to pay tithe, right? They're going to pay tithe on the money that they receive after taxes, correct?
Right,
Some people do, some people don't.
Okay.
that's right.
Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. Anyway,
And that
but let's say
determines-
you do. Let's say this is the scenario, and you want to pay your 10%. But if you give to a 501c3, you have a deduction, so you can sort of fill that 10% gap easier than if you just gave it to a ministry,
Right,
right? Because you could say I'm actually giving 10%, but I have to give more now out of my money. More comes out of my pocket because I also have to pay that tax on that money I give.
hmm
Right? Okay. I've always wondered why this has happened to the church. So anybody know when this first began?
When did the first tax laws
Well,
start getting written?
Well, no. Well, I don't know. When did Adventists become?
I think it was
You
is a,
not pay. I know about this. God did put it in my head right now. You did
Your
talk.
connection's bad, bro.
Yeah. I know that is bad word. Yes, but God did say to me now. He said, "You not pay." The Lord just said, "You not pay to me to my houses. Something will be bad happen to you.
Okay.
You do snap up, pay
Late night.
rent where you use your I give you to live. You need that money to live, that you pay. And some go to me for my house for me to teach you of my Bible.
Late night, midnight.
Right, Theodore,
Yep.
to try to help clarify some of this.
Okay.
Would you consider the money that is given to the church to be an income to the church?
No,
Okay,
because I don't believe in that. I don't believe in businesses or churches.
I agreed with them.
Okay, Mark.
I say yes.
Yeah. So my view is that businesses or churches should not be taxed because they don't exist as only individuals could be taxed because only individuals exist. Businesses don't. But that's more a philosophical point.
yes, that's a very philosophical point.
Yeah. But my view is that the world would be a better place if there was no such thing as the taxing of businesses or groups of people, because the individuals can be taxed already. It sort of becomes a double tax.
So why did they just put out a big thing about needing 85,000 new agents
87,000.
for the IRS?
I know. See, America is very strange because the tax.
Tell me about it.
I mean, they can even tax Americans who are Canadians who live in Canada and already are taxed,
That's right.
which I just find it very bizarre. We had a pastor who was an American, and he had to pay tax in America after he paid tax in Canada.
Okay,
Well, they're two different entities that you're paying to.
Yeah, but a Canadian doesn't pay tax to the Canadian government if he's living in another country. And people don't go to prison for not paying taxes in Canada.
okay, I'll ask a second question then, Theodore.
Yeah.
Does the church, and I mean the corporate church, own the places of worship where members congregate?
Well, it does in Alberta, it does now since 1988, but it didn't used to.
Okay. One of the things about two of the things about a 501c3,
Mhm.
the corporate church is seen as having no income.
Right.
The corporate church is also seen as having no assets.
Right. No income, no assets. Yeah. No revenue.
Strip the 501c3 away, and you have not only income, but you have substantial assets.
Right. Which in my view, that would be avoided if you just didn't recognize institutions. If the government didn't recognize corporations or institutions, which I don't believe that they should.
Well,
Only they
okay.
should recognize individuals. But I understand what you're saying. So the way things are now, this allows a organization. See, my view would be people give money to a church. It's their money. It's people just sharing money. If I get together with my friends and we put some money together to, rent a building for a meeting, I mean, that money went somewhere, right? Because we don't have an official institution. But let's say I take this money. This is actually presented at a business meeting by the church treasurer, that if you take this money and you put it together and you put it in a bank account, it's now taxable by the government. They can tax this money that you put together, that you gathered some money to give to charity or something, to give to some friend who their house burned down, and technically you would be taxed on that money. That was their argument against doing anything like that you need to give the money to the church because then it's not taxable. But the problem is that we create these institutions that control things, and we work with the government. When churches, I think by the Constitution, churches shouldn't be taxed, right? That's what somebody said there earlier. So anyway, I just find the whole thing rather confusing to me. Why people would be motivated. I mean, if the government, let's say the government decided to tax us 90%, that would just be a reality we'd have to live with.
But you wouldn't be able to live for 90% tax, would you?
I don't know. There's some places where it's pretty close to that. I mean, in Sweden, ABBA was taxed more than 100%. So
I don't see how they eating. But
they actually had to make a concession for them but according to their rules, they had to pay more tax than they took in. Right. So
that's the reason I'm sorry, go ahead.
They never became rich. But anyway, the point is, a Christian just has to live with the conditions that exist. He shouldn't compromise just so that he can be better off. Right. So the church is compromised.
It's faith in God for their needs.
What did he say?
I mean, I'm not sure. I didn't catch what you said, Jeff, but what'd you say?
No, it just says a lack of faith,
Yeah.
That's what it boils down to.
I mean, in a sense, governments are oppressive, but we try to cooperate with them so we're not oppressed. But to me, that's a compromise that puts us into a compromising situation when it comes to the Sunday law. The reason that the church is going to support the Sunday law is for the simple reason it's going to be about money. The church is not willing to lose its institutions. And they have continually compromised with the state, not just in the United States, but like in Russia, they compromise with the state. They follow the rules so that their churches aren't confiscated. But wouldn't it be better to have your churches confiscated and follow the gospel?
Definitely.
Could you imagine what the example that would have set?
Yeah. So
Because all it takes is one individual to start a fire.
yeah. So this becomes a pretty interesting situation. I mean, I never really thought about this too much. So maybe how things work. I just know in the U.S. it's quite different than here. But
Well,
mean-
we had a president, Theodore, that wanted to bring in the 5013, the 50, how do you say it, 503C, whatever it is.
501(c)(3).
Yeah,
C3. I can't remember.
we had a president want to bring it in so he could control the churches because they did because he didn't want the churches to come together and sort of like run things. I reckon that's what it is. I forgot the name of the president who signed it into law.
But the idea was that based on the Constitution, you couldn't tax a church.
That's right.
So when did this idea come in that the people who are giving money to a church cannot have that money taxed? When did that come in?
Well, people always get taxed for what they I mean for food and which actually wasn't supposed to be taxed on income to start with under the Constitution.
Yeah, I understand that, but the idea, when did the church buy into this idea that its members could give money to the church and not be taxed on the money they gave to the church? Does anybody know when that began?
I think it was the late 90s.
You think it was the 90s?
That's my opinion, though. I don't know if it's factual. Late 90s.
Well, but in the United States, because we live in Canada, so we have different rules.
It was in 1900s. It was early 1900s.
You think it was the early
I-
1900s?
Yeah.
Oh,
Early.
What, Dwight?
no.
I don't think so. I think it would be fairly recent.
Well, I'm looking at something here that 501c3 was enacted more by the Johnson Amendment in 1954.
Okay, so 1954. So that's fairly recent, before I was born, but still, recent.
So we're speaking of a year before they started their conversations
Evangelical.
that led to the abomination that was fostered upon the church. Questions on doctrine.
But yeah, so it's rather interesting to me, this whole point, because this is a line of thinking I've never really mulled over.
Who was the president on Dwight
Johnson, right?
Johnson?
In 1954,
Who was the president?
Yeah.
Eisenhower.
Oh, Heisen. Okay. Okay.
Johnson would have been one of the key people in the Senate at that time, and I'm speaking of Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Well, I don't know much about America, but I'm learning more all the time. Okay, so this is something we're going to come back to next Friday night. We're going to come back to this and look at this more, what's happening. But what I see is this sort of parallel, but it's in reverse. It's a mirror in some ways. So Ron has in 1969, the Tax Reform Act gave us section 501c3. But were there things similar to that before 501c3? That's the question. Yeah,
What year?
69. So if it's like in 54, okay. So any final thoughts on this? My mind has officially shut down.
Mine too.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'm up kind of late too.
Yeah, well, I was up really early, so.
Yeah, me too.
Been awake for about 20 hours, so I'm working.
Not that early.
Okay, so if there's no further thoughts, let's close with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are so very thankful for the study that we had this evening and the things we can learn. And pray for each person, Lord. We ask that you can help us as we continue to study these things, as we enjoy the hours of the Sabbath in fellowship with you and with one another. And we just ask, Lord, that you can be with us in the meeting tomorrow morning that Dwight presents. And we ask, Lord, for your Spirit to continue to work upon our hearts. We know, Lord, that we need you to show us not just our need, but to give us strength to overcome the defects in our character and to give us power that we can witness to others. Please be with each person. May your angels watch over us. And may the Sabbath truly be a blessing. We pray and ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.